The stagecoach rolled into Dust Creek, Texas, on a sweltering afternoon in the summer of 1879, carrying one passenger who would change everything about the town, and about one particular cowboy who had long since stopped believing that anything worth changing could still find him. She stepped down from the coach with the kind of careful grace that suggested she had rehearsed the moment, or perhaps that she had simply been raised in a world where even descending from a vehicle was an act requiring poise. Her dark hair was pinned under a traveling bonnet that had seen better days, the ribbon fraying at the bow, the brim dusty from the long journey. Her dress was deep blue, practical wool despite the heat, and she clutched a leather traveling bag against her ribs as though it contained everything she owned in the world, which, in point of fact, it did. She looked around at the main street of Dust Creek, the crooked row of wooden buildings, the horses tied to posts, the men in wide-brimmed hats squinting at her from beneath the shade of awnings, and her expression was not fear exactly. It was the look of someone who had made a decision too large to undo, and was only now beginning to understand the weight of it. The stagecoach driver set her trunk down on the boards beside her with a grunt and immediately climbed back to his seat. He had long since given up trying to speak to her. The woman beside him on the journey from San Antonio had been pleasant enough, had smiled when smiled at, had nodded when addressed, but every word she had offered in return had been utterly incomprehensible. The town looked at her. She looked at the town. Jeremiah Barlow saw her from across the street, where he had been leaning against the post outside the general store waiting for the owner, Dale Hutchins, to finish tallying the order for the Barlow Ranch. He was 27 years old, lean and sun-bronzed, with dark eyes beneath the brim of a well-worn hat and hands that showed every callus earned from 6 years of ranching. He was not a man given to staring at strangers, but there was something about this woman standing alone on the boardwalk with her trunk and her leather bag and her absolute, complete aloneness that made him straighten up and take notice. She said something to no one in particular. It was soft, almost to herself, and it was entirely in French. He had never heard French spoken before. He had heard Spanish, plenty of it, from the vaqueros who worked the ranches south of town, and he had heard the lilting German of the settlers who farmed the river bottoms east of Dust Creek. But this was different. This was something older sounding, something that came from so far away it felt like it had traveled across an ocean just to reach this particular dusty street and land in his ears. She looked directly at him then because he was staring and she had noticed, and she said, quite clearly and with evident hope, "Excusez-moi, monsieur. Pourriez-vous m'indiquer où se trouve le bureau du sheriff?" Jeremiah pushed off the post. He crossed the street because it seemed like the only decent thing to do, and when he reached her he took his hat off, which was a habit his mother had drilled into him, and which he had never been able to shake when speaking to a woman. "Ma'am," he said, "I am sorry. I do not understand a word of what you just said." She stared at him. Her eyes were gray, he noticed, the particular gray of a cloudy sky just before it decides whether to rain or clear, and they were intelligent and frustrated in equal measure. She tried again slowly as if pace might somehow bridge the gap that language could not. "G church quelqu'un, unham, monsieur." She stopped, reached into the leather bag and produced a folded letter. She held it out to him. He took it carefully, opened it, and read the name written inside. It was an address, a name, and a short paragraph in French he could not decipher. But the name was clear enough. Thomas Marchand, Dust Creek, Texas. "Thomas Marchand," he read aloud. Her face lit up with such relief that it was almost painful to watch, because it was the relief of someone who had been afraid for a very long time. "Oui," she said. "Oui, Thomas Marchand. Vous le connaissez." "I know of him," Jeremiah said slowly. He ran a land office here. "Ma'am," he paused, unsure how to deliver news to someone who could not understand the delivery. He pointed at the letter, then at his own face, and said, "Tom Marchand. He passed away 4 months ago, fever." She watched his face with the attention of someone reading a map in unfamiliar country. She understood his expression before she understood his words. Her face changed. The relief drained out of it and left something quieter and considerably more frightening in its place, because what it left was not grief exactly. It was the realization of being entirely without a plan. "Il est mort," she whispered. Jeremiah did not know what that meant, but he recognized the question in it and nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am, I am sorry." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, almost inaudibly, "Je suis seul." He could not know it yet, but she had just said, "I am alone." Her name was Frances Pritchard, born in Lyon, France in 1855, making her 24 years old on that particular sweltering afternoon, and she had come to Texas on the strength of a letter from Thomas Marchand, who had been her late mother's cousin, and who had promised her a position as a governess for a family he knew in Dust Creek. The position was real enough. The family was real. But Thomas Marchand was not any longer, and Frances had no way of knowing which family it was, or where they lived, or how to explain any of this to anyone around her. She had learned to read English in Lyon, from a tutor who had specialized in the language, but reading and speaking were two entirely different creatures, and the English she had absorbed from books bore almost no resemblance to the English she was now hearing around her, with its dropped syllables and its regional drawl and its speed. Jeremiah Barlow stood in the street holding her letter and thought about the situation for a long moment. He had ranching to get back to. He had an order to collect from Dale Hutchins and a 2-hour ride home, and a dozen things waiting for him. He also had, as his father had always said, a constitutional inability to walk away from something that needed fixing. "You need somewhere to stay," he said, and he pointed at the hotel up the street, a 2-story building with a wooden sign reading Dust Creek Hotel. "Hotel," he said, pronouncing it carefully. "You understand, hotel." "Hotel," she repeated and nodded and looked at the building, and then looked back at him with an expression that he would only later understand had been asking a very specific question. "Can I afford it?" He went back into the general store and asked Dale Hutchins whether he knew anything about Tom Marchand's arrangements before he died, whether there was a family expecting a French governess. Dale, who had lived in Dust Creek for 20 years and knew everyone's business, scratched his beard and said that, as a matter of fact, he believed the family was the Caldwells, who farmed cotton 6 miles south. And he believed they had been expecting someone from France but had not heard anything and had assumed the arrangement had fallen through. Jeremiah came back out with this information and stood before Frances Pritchard and attempted to explain it. He said the name Caldwell. He pointed south. He held up 6 fingers and then made a riding motion with his hands, which made him feel considerably foolish. But she nodded with what seemed like comprehension and said something in French that ended with Caldwell. "Caldwell," he confirmed. She studied him for a moment, and then she did something entirely unexpected. She held out her hand, not as a woman offering a hand to be kissed in the European fashion, but flat and open like she meant it for shaking, and she said, "Je m'appelle Frances Pritchard." He understood that much. He shook her hand. "Jeremiah Barlow," he said, and she smiled. It was the first smile she had offered since stepping off the coach, and it rearranged her whole face into something warm and considerably more formidable than it had appeared before. "Jeremiah," she repeated, carefully, giving each syllable its full weight. No one had ever said his name quite like that before. He arranged for her to stay at the hotel for the night, advancing the $2 cost from his own pocket with the knowledge that he could be reimbursed by the Caldwells once the situation was sorted. He retrieved her trunk from the boardwalk and carried it up the hotel stairs himself, because the young man who should have done it was nowhere to be found, and left her at the door of the room with a small bow that he immediately felt ridiculous about. "Tomorrow," he said, holding up one finger, "I will take you to Caldwell." He pointed at himself and then pointed out the window toward the south. "Tomorrow morning," she understood. She pressed her hands together in a gesture of gratitude that looked almost like prayer and said, "Merci, Monsieur Barlow, merci beaucoup." "You are welcome," he said, and left her there. He rode home that evening with the setting sun burning red behind him, and spent half the ride thinking about the color of gray eyes and the sound of a language he did not understand, and told himself firmly that there was absolutely nothing in that to dwell on. He did not sleep especially well. He was back at the hotel before 8 in the morning with his wagon, having told his ranch hand, Pete Sorensen, to manage the morning feeding without him. Frances Pritchard was already waiting outside, her trunk and bag assembled, her blue dress exchanged for a slightly lighter gray one, her bonnet tied fresh. She looked, he thought, like she had been up for hours. She had been. She had sat in the room through the night writing in a small journal she carried everywhere, writing in French because it was the only way she could think, working through what she knew and what she did not know and what she intended to find out. She had written, among other things, "The cowboy who helped me is called Jeremiah. He has kind eyes and appears to be a man of his word. I must learn English. I cannot remain mute in this country. Being without language is like being without hands." The ride to the Caldwell farm took just over an hour, and it was during this ride, jolting along the dry Texas road with the mesquite trees on either side and the enormous blue sky overhead, that the teaching began. Frances looked around her at the landscape and pointed at things. She would point and say the French word, then look at Jeremiah and wait. He would give her the English. She would repeat it until she had it to her satisfaction, and then she would point at the next thing. "El arbor," she said, pointing at a mesquite. "Tree," he said. "Tree," she repeated. "Et celui-là," she pointed at a distant cluster of cottonwoods by a dry creek bed. "Tree as well," he said. "Different kind." "Cottonwood, cottonwood," she said, feeling the word. "And this?" She tapped the wagon seat. "Seat, bench, some would say." "Bench," she nodded. She pointed at the horses. "Cheval," she said, and then waited. "Horse," he said. She laughed suddenly, a genuine laugh, and said something in French that made her laugh again. "What?" he asked, smiling despite himself. She shook her head, still smiling. "It is," she stopped. She had known the word. She searched. "It is funny." Cheval sounds like it should be a beautiful word for a beautiful thing. Horse sounds like, she made a gesture with her hand, a blunt, flat gesture, like dropping something. He stared at her. "You spoke English," he said. She looked startled by this observation. "A little," she admitted in careful, accented English. "I can read more than I can speak. Speaking is," she tapped her throat. "My mouth does not know the words my eyes know." "Your mouth will learn," he said. She looked at him sidelong. "You sound very certain of that." "I have faith in mouths that are trying," he said, and then felt that had come out somewhat oddly and looked back at the road. She decided in that moment that she liked Jeremiah Barlow considerably. The Caldwell farm was a solid, respectable operation, a whitewashed farmhouse, a red barn, cotton fields stretching to the south, and a small pen of chickens that raised an enormous fuss when the wagon rolled into the yard. Edna Caldwell came out onto the porch drying her hands on her apron, a stout, energetic woman in her 40s with sharp brown eyes and a generous mouth. Her husband, William Caldwell, appeared from the barn a moment later, broad-shouldered and sun-weathered. Jeremiah explained the situation: Tom Marchand's death, the woman's arrival, his own role in it, while Frances stood beside the wagon and waited with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to being discussed without being consulted. Edna Caldwell looked at Frances for a long moment and then walked directly to her, took both of her hands and said loudly and warmly, as if volume might translate, "We have been waiting for you, honey. You come right on inside." Frances understood the warmth, if not all of the words, and she let herself be drawn toward the house, looking back once over her shoulder at Jeremiah, who was standing with his hat in his hands, feeling oddly bereft. The Caldwells had 3 children, a boy of 12 named Robert, a girl of 9 named Clara, and a boy of 6 named Henry. Their previous governess had left 2 months prior to marry a railroad man from Austin, and Edna Caldwell had been managing the children, schooling herself in the meantime with what she described as diminishing results. Frances, who had been educated at a convent school in Lyon and had tutored children there for 3 years, was exactly what the Caldwells needed, and the Caldwells were exactly what Frances needed. Within an hour, the trunk was in the room at the top of the stairs that had been prepared for a governess, and Frances was sitting at the kitchen table drinking the strongest coffee she had encountered since leaving France. Jeremiah should have left. He said his goodbyes to William Caldwell and shook the man's hand and collected his wagon. He got as far as the edge of the yard. Then he turned around. He told himself it was because he ought to make sure the situation was settled. He walked back to the house and knocked at the kitchen door, and Edna let him in, and Frances looked up from the table with surprise and then something that looked suspiciously like relief. "I thought," Jeremiah said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands again, "that perhaps I could come by on Saturdays, if that would be agreeable to you all, to help with—" he was not entirely sure how to finish the sentence honestly. "To help with translation," he said, "while Miss Pritchard settles in." Edna Caldwell gave him a look that contained approximately 17 years of accumulated wisdom about young men who suddenly developed helpful natures in the vicinity of young women and said, "That would be very agreeable, Jeremiah." Frances looked at him steadily. Then she said, in careful English, "And maybe you will teach me more words." "I expect I will," he said. "Then maybe," she said and paused, choosing deliberately, "I will teach you something too." "Such as?" he asked. She smiled, and it was the same smile that had rearranged her face on the boardwalk the day before. "French," she said. "We begin with my name. In French, Frances is—" She pronounced it the French way, Frances, with the second syllable soft and the whole word landing like something meant to be held carefully. "That is how you say it properly." "Frances," he tried. She shook her head. "Again." He tried again. She tilted her head, considering. "Better," she said. "We will practice." He rode home that evening with the distinct feeling that something had begun, and that he was not entirely in control of what it was, and that this did not trouble him as much as it probably should have. The Saturdays became a fixture with a speed that surprised even Jeremiah. He told himself the first week that it was neighborly, that it was simply the right thing to do. The second week, he told himself that Frances was still finding her footing, and that it would be cruel to abandon the routine before she was comfortable. By the third week, he had stopped telling himself anything in particular, because the story he was constructing was becoming increasingly thin, and he was an honest man. The lessons were genuine and serious, and also, frequently, hilarious. Frances had a quick mind and an iron determination, and she attacked the English language the way Jeremiah imagined a general might approach a campaign, systematically, with detailed preparation. She had begun keeping a notebook, a small leather-bound thing she carried always, in which she wrote English words and their French counterparts and small notes about usage. She corrected herself aloud when she made errors, and would not be mollified with the assurance that she was doing well. "Doing well is not good enough," she said one Saturday in late September, sitting across from him at the Caldwell kitchen table while the children played outside and Edna worked in the garden. "I must do correctly. There is a difference. People will understand you either way," Jeremiah said. "Understanding is not the same as respect," she said, with a precision that told him this was something she had thought about for a long time. When a person speaks poorly, they are heard poorly. Their ideas become, she searched, smaller in the listener's mind. Jeremiah considered that. "That does not seem fair." "No," she agreed, "but it is true, and I did not come to Texas to be small." He looked at her across the table, this woman from Lyon who had crossed an ocean and half a continent on a borrowed promise and then rebuilt the entire plan from scratch when the promise was gone, and he thought that she was the least small person he had ever met. "Tell me something," he said. "In French, whatever comes to mind." She blinked. "Why?" "Because I want to understand what it sounds like. I want to hear what you sound like when you are not searching for words." Something shifted in her expression. She looked at him for a moment, and then she began to speak, and the French came out of her like water released from a dam, fluid and musical and entirely herself. She spoke for perhaps 2 minutes, not looking at him, looking at the window and the light outside, and her hands moved slightly as she talked, the way they always did in French but rarely did in English, as though the language itself required more of her body. When she stopped, he said, "What did you say?" "I described the first morning I ever saw the ocean," she said. "I was 8 years old. My father took my mother and me to Marseille on the train. I had read about the ocean but never seen it. When I stood on the shore and looked at it, I could not understand how something so large could exist without someone telling it where to stop." Jeremiah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Say that again in French, just that last part." She said it. The syllables moved through the air of the Caldwell kitchen like something from another world. "How do you say that in English?" he asked. "How could something so large exist without someone telling it where to stop?" she said. "Why?" "Because I want to remember it," he said. "Both ways." She looked at him with something she was not yet ready to name, closed her notebook and said, "Repeat after me." For his part, Jeremiah took to French with less systematic ferocity, but more natural ear than Frances had expected. He had a musical quality to his speech that he was entirely unaware of, a slight rhythm to his sentences that made him, she thought, a better candidate for language learning than he credited himself. He learned her name first, and he practiced it every week, and by October he could say it properly without concentration, Frances, and every time he used it her name sounded like something worth having. He learned other things. He learned bonjour and bonsoir and s'il vous plaît. He learned that the French word for sky was ciel, which he thought was too small a word for the Texas sky, and he told her so, and she said that the Texas sky was too large for any language, and that was probably why it was such good country for silence. He learned that silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was, in fact, the opposite. He would sit at the Caldwell table or walk with her along the fence line at the edge of the cotton field or stand beside her at the corral gate, while Robert Caldwell worked with the horse he was learning to ride, and they would be quiet together for long stretches, and the quiet had a quality that he had not experienced before. It felt inhabited. It felt like something rather than nothing. In October, the town of Dust Creek had a social gathering, a harvest dance held in the open field behind the church, which happened every year and which drew people from ranches and farms within a 20-mile radius. Jeremiah, who usually attended with his ranch hand Pete, and spent the evening talking cattle prices with other ranchers, arrived to find Frances Pritchard standing with Edna Caldwell near the refreshment table, looking out at the dancers with an expression he had learned to recognize as the one she wore when she was taking in more than she was showing. She was wearing the blue dress again, but she had done something to her hair. It was down partially, not fully pinned, loose at the sides, and it caught the lantern light from the line strung between the poles, and she was so entirely herself in that moment, so completely Frances Pritchard from Lyon, France, standing in a cotton field in Texas with fiddle music rising around her, that Jeremiah stopped walking 10 feet away from her and simply looked. Pete Sorensen, who was beside him, said, "You going to stand there all night, or are you going to go say hello to the French lady?" Jeremiah walked forward. "Miss Pritchard," he said. "Monsieur Barlow," she returned, and there was a smile in it. "You are not dancing," he said. "No one has asked me," she said, simply and without self-pity, as though it were merely a fact to be noted. "Would you like to?" he asked. She looked at the dancers. The fiddle was playing something fast, a reel, and the couples were spinning. "I do not know these dances," she said. "I can show you," he said. She looked at him, this time with the particular assessment she gave to proposals that interested her but that she was not yet prepared to accept without examination. "Can you dance?" she asked. "Adequately," he said. "That is the most honest answer I have ever received to that question," she said, and held out her hand. He was not, in truth, merely adequate. He had grown up in a family where his mother had insisted her sons learn to dance properly, and while Jeremiah would not have called himself graceful, he was competent and steady, and he led well. Frances, who had learned the polka and the quadrille in Lyon, adapted to the reel within 2 turns with the same focused intelligence she brought to everything, and by the third dance she was laughing not politely, not socially, but genuinely, with her head thrown slightly back and her eyes bright with the exertion of it. He had never heard her laugh that way before. He wanted to hear it again for the rest of his life, and the clarity of that one arrived with such sudden conviction that he nearly stumbled. They danced 4 dances. Then they walked away from the crowd to catch their breath, down toward the fence where the lantern light thinned out into darkness, and stood looking up at the night sky, which was doing its enormous Texas thing, filling from horizon to horizon with stars. In France, Frances said, the sky at night is smaller. There are more buildings, more things in the way. You miss it, he asked. She thought about this genuinely. I miss the sounds, she said. A lion sounds in the evening, the bells from the cathedral, the people on the streets. It is a noisy city. I miss knowing what every sound means. She paused. Here there are sounds I do not know yet. Like what? The thing that calls in the night, the high sound. Ah, she stopped and then said it in French, which was not helpful, and then said, the dog that is not a dog. Coyote, he said. Coyote, she repeated. Yes, I hear it and I still do not know if I should be afraid. You should not, he said. Not of coyotes. What should I be afraid of, she asked. He looked at the sky for a moment. Droughts, he said. They can ruin a year's work. And rattlesnakes, watch where you walk in the long grass. And he stopped, and she prompted. And men who don't have good intentions, he said, though I think you know how to manage those. She made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been amusement. I have been managing since I was 14, she said. When my father died. Then I managed for my mother until she died also 3 years ago. Then I managed alone. She said this without self-pity either, just the plain delivery of facts. Thomas Marchand's letter was the first time in 3 years I had not been managing entirely alone. You had been managing just fine when I met you, he said. I was terrified, she said. He looked at her. You did not look it. Good, she said. I worked very hard not to look it. They stood in comfortable quiet for a moment. The fiddle had started something slow now, a waltz, and it drifted to them on the October air. Frances, he said, and he said it correctly, the French way, Frances, and she turned her head to look at him with an expression that was soft and open in a way it very rarely was. I know you have been managing alone for a long time. I just want you to know that you do not have to manage entirely alone anymore, whatever that is worth to you. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly and in French, Je ne suis plus seul. He did not know the words, but he knew from her face and her voice that they meant something good, and he filed them away to ask about later. What she had said was, I am no longer alone. The autumn deepened, and the Saturdays continued, and Frances's English grew with a speed that was remarkable to everyone who witnessed it. By November, she was conducting the Caldwell children's lessons almost entirely in English, slipping into French only when a concept particularly resisted translation. Robert, who was 12 and had reached the age of finding most things embarrassing, had decided that Frances was nonetheless worth admiring because she rode a horse with a confidence that surprised everyone, having ridden since childhood in France, and when she learned the word lasso, and insisted on being shown how it was thrown, he was the one who taught her, and she practiced it with the same relentless determination she brought to everything until she could land the loop around a fence post 3 times out of 4. Jeremiah heard about this from Edna Caldwell during one of his Saturday visits and arrived the following week with a proper lasso of his own, which he presented to Frances with no particular ceremony, just handed it to her when she came out to meet the wagon. She held it and looked at it and then looked at him. This is a gift, she said. A practical one, he said. I did not think you were the kind of man who gave impractical gifts, she said, with a slight smile. What kind of man do you think I am? He asked. She looped the rope through her hands, considering. You are the kind of man, she said slowly, in English that was now fluent and only occasionally searched for a word, who does the right thing because it is the right thing, not because someone is watching, who says less than he thinks, who is more worried about other people than about himself. She paused. Who is lonely, she added more quietly, even though he does not say so. The honesty of it was so direct that he had no prepared response. He stood in the Caldwell yard with the morning sun on his face and simply said, "Yes to all of that." "Me too," she said. "The lonely part." "Less so lately," he said carefully. She looked at the rope in her hands and then back at him with that look. She had the one that was neither coy nor shy but simply honest, deeply honest, as though deception were a foreign tongue she had never bothered to learn. "Yes," she said, "less so lately." He did not reach for her hand that morning. He was not the kind of man who moved quickly, and she was not the kind of woman who would have respected him if he had. But something had been said between them, and it settled into the November air like something permanent. The following Saturday, when he arrived at the Caldwell farm, he found the household in a mild crisis. Little Henry, the 6-year-old, had developed a fever in the night. Edna was nursing him upstairs. William had ridden to fetch the doctor from town, and Frances was in the kitchen managing Robert and Clara, keeping them fed and calm and occupied in the way that she managed all things, with steady attention and no visible alarm. Jeremiah took off his coat and helped without being asked. He brought water from the well. He sat with Robert and Clara and talked to them about horses and nothing in particular while Frances went upstairs to relieve Edna for a while, and when she came back down her face showed, for the first time he had seen, genuine worry. "He is very warm," she said. "The doctor will come," Jeremiah said. "William will be back within 2 hours." She sat down at the table and put her hands flat on the wood and breathed. He had never seen her do that before, that deliberate, conscious act of gathering herself. "In France," she said quietly, "I watched my mother grow sick. There was a doctor, he came, it did not help, she stopped. I know it is not the same, Henry is young, he is strong, I know that. But it reminds you," he said. "Yes." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. It was the first time he had touched her hand with intention, and she looked down at it and then up at him and did not move her hand away. "He is going to be fine," Jeremiah said. "I will stay until the doctor comes." "You do not have to," she said, but her hand stayed under his. "I know I do not have to," he said. She nodded, and her eyes were bright with something she was pressing down, and she did not cry, which he had somehow known she would not, and they sat like that until they heard the wagon returning and Edna calling down the stairs. The doctor was a good one. His name was Gerald Hewitt, a capable man who had come to Dust Creek 8 years prior, and who was grimly methodical in the way of frontier doctors who had seen everything, and learned to stay calm regardless. He confirmed that it was a fever, likely from something Henry had eaten that had not agreed with him, prescribed rest and cool cloths and a specific tea, and predicted the boy would be bouncing around the farm within 3 days. He was correct. Henry recovered by Tuesday to the relief of everyone, and Frances arrived at her Saturday lesson with Jeremiah looking easier and more rested than the week before. "Thank you," she said, "for last Saturday." "Nothing to thank me for," he said. "You stayed all day," she said, "and into the evening." "I did not have anywhere more important to be," he said honestly. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Say something in French, whatever you know." He thought. He had been practicing not formally but privately in the evenings at the ranch when the day's work was done. He would look at the words she had written in the notebook. She had given him a duplicate of her own, gifted without comment one Saturday in October, and he would say them aloud to the empty room and to Pete Sorensen, who thought the whole business was both puzzling and excellent. "Je m'appelle Jeremiah," he said. "My name is Jeremiah." He paused, collecting the words. "Et je suis content de te connaître, and I am glad to know you." She stared at him. "You have been practicing," she said. "A little," he said. "Where did you learn that last part?" "I looked it up," he said. "I asked a man in town who had been to New Orleans. He knew some." She looked at him for a long moment. "Je suis content de te connaître aussi," she said softly. "I am glad to know you too." "Also," he said, "I know that one." She laughed, and it was the real laugh again, the full one, and he thought, not for the first time or the last, that it was the best sound in Texas. December arrived with a cold that was sharp by Texas standards, which meant that by the standards of Lyon, France, it was a mild autumn day, and Frances regarded the Texan's response to it with affectionate bewilderment. She wore her warmest wool dress and was perfectly comfortable, and Jeremiah arrived on his Saturdays with a heavier coat and what she thought was an endearingly stern attitude toward the cold, as though it were an inconvenience that had occurred through personal failing. He brought her a book in December. It was a novel, Jane Eyre, which he had ordered from the bookstore in San Antonio on Pete Sorensen's advice, Pete having a sister who read constantly. He handed it to her without ceremony, the way he handled gifts, just placed it on the table. "For the English," he said. "Reading helps, you said." She picked it up and looked at the cover and then opened to the first page and read the first paragraph, and he watched her face travel through some private country and come out the other side looking moved. "Have you read it?" she asked. "No," he said. "Then I will read it to you," she said. "Some of it, on Saturdays, as practice for both of us." "What will I be practicing?" he asked. "Listening," she said, "and imagining a world different from this one." And so that was added to the Saturdays. Frances reading Jane Eyre aloud in the Caldwell kitchen, her accent still present but thinning week by week, her voice steady and expressive, and Jeremiah across the table listening with more attention than he had given any book since he had left school at 16 to work the ranch beside his father. He had, in fact, read more than he let on. His mother had raised readers. He knew the Bible well and had read some Shakespeare, and he subscribed to the newspaper from Austin that came 3 days late by mail. But he had never listened to anyone read aloud with this kind of feeling, never understood until now that a story read by the right voice could become something entirely different from the same words on a page. She read Jane Eyre's declaration, "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me," with such particular ferocity that he looked up from the table and found her looking directly at him, which he did not think was an accident. "That is how you feel," he said. "About here, about Texas." "About anywhere," she said. "About everything." She set the book down. "My mother wanted me to marry a man in Lyon before she died. A good man, respectable, well-situated. I refused." "Why?" "Because I would have disappeared," she said. "Inside his life. I would have become," she made a gesture with her hand, that blunt, flat, dropping gesture. "Small," she said. "You keep using that word," he said. "Because it is the thing I am most afraid of," she said. "More than the coyote," he smiled. "I would never ask you to be small," he said. The words landed in the room with a weight that surprised both of them. She looked at him steadily and he looked back, and neither of them moved. "No," she said at last, very quietly. "I know you would not." Christmas came to Dust Creek with the same combination of festivity and practicality that characterized everything in the town. The church put up a tree. Edna Caldwell made more food than any 5 families could consume. The Caldwell children were in a state of chronic excitement for the 2 weeks preceding the holiday, which made Frances's attempts to continue lessons something of a challenge, and she managed it with a combination of firmness and good humor that impressed Edna enormously. Jeremiah spent Christmas Day with his widowed aunt in town, as he did every year, but on the day before Christmas he came to the Caldwell farm with a purpose he had spent 3 weeks building too. He arrived in the early afternoon and found Frances alone in the sitting room, the children having been sent upstairs and William and Edna busy in the kitchen. She was sitting by the window with a letter in her lap, and she looked up when he came in with an expression that shifted between the private and the welcoming. "A letter from France?" he asked. "From a friend in Lyon," she said. "She wants to know if I am well." She folded it carefully. "She asks if I miss home." She paused. "I have been sitting here for an hour trying to answer that honestly." "What is the honest answer?" he asked. She looked at the window. "I miss things about it," she said. "The food, the smell of the river. The cathedral bells I told you about, my friend." But she stopped. "Home is not the same thing as a place you have left. I am beginning to think that." He sat down in the chair across from her. He had his hat in his hands. He was doing the thing with the hat again, which she had come to recognize as the sign that he was preparing to say something he had been preparing to say for a while. "There is something I want to ask you," he said. "Yes." she said, and her voice was careful, and not because she was uncertain what was coming, but because she wanted to be very sure she heard it correctly. He looked at his hat and then at her. "I know that Texas is not France," he said. "And I know that my ranch is not Lyon, and that a cattle ranch is not what you imagined when you got on that stagecoach in San Antonio. And I know that we have known each other for—" He paused, and she saw him counting. 5 months and 2 weeks. 5 months and 3 weeks, she said. He looked up. She said it with such composure that he almost thought he had been mistaken, and then he saw the expression behind the composure, and he was not mistaken at all. "Frances," he said, using her name the French way, which always undid something in her chest. "I am going to say this as directly as I know how, because you are a direct person and you deserve directness in return." He held her gaze. "I love you, not in the way a man loves something because it is new or because it is interesting. In the way a man loves something because he cannot imagine himself clearly without it anymore. You have—" He stopped, and she could see him searching, and she had never loved him more than in this moment when he was searching because the ordinary words were not sufficient. "You have made me understand what it would mean to be known," he said. "Properly known. And I would very much like the chance to know you for the rest of my life." The room was very quiet. Outside, the winter wind moved through the mesquite trees with a dry whisper. Frances Pritchard looked at Jeremiah Barlow and thought about the journey from Lyon, about the fear on the boardwalk of Dust Creek, about the letter from Thomas Marchand that had been both the reason she was here and the thing that had fallen apart, and about how sometimes the plan that fails is the only route to the place you were meant to be. "Gt aim," she said, "I love you. That is the answer in French." She paused. "In English, yes. Yes to all of it. Yes." He crossed the room in 2 strides and took her hands and held them, and she stood, and they stood very close together in the winter light of the Caldwell sitting room, and he said her name again, the French way, and she put one hand up to the side of his face and said his name back, and then he kissed her, and she kissed him, and the world outside continued doing its enormous Texas things entirely, without regard for the fact that something quiet and enormous was happening inside the farmhouse. From upstairs, there was an absolute racket of shushing and giggling, and it was clear that at least 2 of the Caldwell children had been watching through the banister. Frances broke away laughing, and Jeremiah laughed too, and they stood there laughing together in the way of people who have just arrived somewhere they have been traveling toward for a long time. They told the Caldwells that evening, though Edna Caldwell received this information with the expression of a woman who was not even slightly surprised. William Caldwell shook Jeremiah's hand for a long time and said he was a good man and meant every word of it. Robert affected not to care. Clara cried with happiness, which she denied. Henry ate a second piece of pie. Jeremiah told his aunt, who wept and said she had prayed for exactly this and could not believe God had also made the woman French, which she meant as the highest possible compliment. He told Pete Sorensen, who said, "I know, everyone knows. The whole county knows. You are the last person who did not know." The engagement was announced in the new year of 1880, and the town of Dust Creek had various reactions to it, most of them warm. There was one notable exception in the form of a man named Carl Deacon, who had fancied himself a candidate for Jeremiah Barlow's ranch through the convenient purchase of the adjacent land, and who had spent considerable energy cultivating the friendship with half an eye toward whatever might come of Jeremiah remaining unmarried. Carl Deacon presented himself to the Caldwell farm one January afternoon with a manner that was correct on the surface and oily beneath it, and spent 20 minutes speaking to Frances in the slow, loud English that people use when they are trying to demonstrate patience they do not have, making clear in a dozen small ways that he thought her presence in Dust Creek a kind of charming peculiarity rather than a fact of lasting import. Frances listened to him with the expression she reserved for things requiring significant patience on her part, and when he was done she said, in English that was now clear and precise and entirely certain of itself, "Thank you for your visit, Monsieur Deacon. I am sure Jeremiah will be pleased to know you called." And she looked at the door with a directness that left Carl Deacon no option but to go through it. She told Jeremiah about it on the following Saturday, and he listened with a particular quality of stillness that she had learned meant he was angry and managing it. "I will speak with him," he said. "You do not need to," she said. "I handled it." "I know you did," he said. "That is not why I am speaking with him." She studied his face. "Then why?" "Because he should understand," Jeremiah said, "that you are not something to be condescended to, and that if he cannot manage that understanding on his own, it should be provided." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know, in French there is a word solidaire. It means something like being in solidarity with someone, being on their side in the way that is bone deep." "Yes," he said, "that is the word." Jeremiah did speak with Carl Deacon, briefly and without heat, in the manner of a man stating a fact rather than making a threat. Carl Deacon's behavior did not exactly improve, but it removed itself from Frances's immediate vicinity, which amounted to the same thing. They were married in April of 1880 in the Dusk Creek Church, on a morning when the sky was doing its most magnificent thing, blue from edge to edge, impossibly clear, with a single hawk circling so high overhead it was almost invisible. The church was full. Edna Caldwell cried. Henry Caldwell was removed briefly from the pew for attempting to climb the windowsill. Pete Sorensen wore his best shirt and looked uncomfortable and very pleased. Dr. Hewitt was there. Even Dale Hutchins from the general store, who had played a small and entirely unknowing part in the story by pointing Jeremiah toward the Caldwells that first day. Frances wore a white dress that she had made herself over the course of 3 months, a process she had undertaken with the same methodical determination she brought to everything, consulting Edna on the particulars of Texas fabric and adapting a French pattern she knew by heart. It had a high neck with small pearl buttons and a skirt that moved when she walked, and she carried a small bunch of wildflowers that Clara Caldwell had picked that morning from the fields. She walked down the aisle of the church alone, because there was no one to walk with her, and she walked with her chin up and her eyes forward and a composure that was not cold but was entirely hers, and when she reached Jeremiah and saw his face, she let the composure soften into something real and warm and visible. He looked at her as though she had just arrived again, the way she had arrived that first afternoon, but without the uncertainty this time. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he intends to spend the rest of his life being grateful for. The minister, a steady man named Aldous Fletcher, conducted the service in English, and Jeremiah had asked if he might add one thing which he had prepared. When the moment came, he looked at Frances and said, clearly and carefully, in the French he had been practicing since December, "Tu es la personne que je cherchais sans savoir que je cherchais." You are the person I was looking for without knowing I was looking. There was a silence in the church that was not emptiness but the opposite of it, and Frances held his hands and said, "We," which needed no translation, and then she said, "And you, Jeremiah Barlow, are the best English lesson I have ever had." The congregation laughed, and she smiled, and he smiled, and Aldous Fletcher said they might as well get on with it, and so they did. Life on the Barlow ranch was different from what Frances had known, and she approached the difference with her characteristic combination of observation and adaptation. The ranch was 1,200 acres of mixed grass and scrub, with a herd of 200 cattle and a good-sized stable. The house was solid but Spartan, built by Jeremiah's father 20 years before, with a large kitchen, a sitting room, 2 bedrooms, and a front porch that faced west and caught the evening light in a way that Frances decided, the first time she sat on it at dusk, was one of the finest things she had seen in Texas. She was not a woman who needed to be told what to do with herself. Within a week, she had reorganized the kitchen to a logic that made Jeremiah temporarily unable to find anything, and then permanently able to find everything. She kept her notebooks still, the French-English ones from the early Saturdays, though now they served a different purpose. She had begun writing observations about Texas, about the ranch, about the sky and the grass and the cattle and the way a thunderstorm built itself over the plains with a theatrical grandeur that Lyon had never offered. She thought that she might write a book one day. She was not certain about this, but she was not uncertain either. She also continued, at the Caldwells' request, to teach the children 3 mornings a week, riding herself the 6 miles south, which she did on the horse Jeremiah had chosen for her, a gray mare with an easy temperament that Frances named Ciel, the French word for sky, and that Jeremiah called Sky in English. It became the first horse in Texas to have a bilingual name and seemed entirely untroubled by the distinction. The Caldwells remained close, and the friendship between the two families deepened through 1880 and into 1881. Edna Caldwell was the closest thing Frances had to a confidant in Dust Creek, the person she talked to when she needed to talk to someone who was not Jeremiah about things that involved Jeremiah, and Edna provided this service with great wisdom and a complete absence of judgment. In the early summer of 1881, Frances told Jeremiah that she was expecting a child. She told him on the front porch at dusk, in the way she told important things directly, looking at his face, watching for his response. His response was to go very still for a moment, and then to breathe in the way of someone who has just received something they wanted so much they had not let themselves want it fully. "Are you well?" he asked. "You feel well?" "I feel entirely well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, nothing serious." He took her hand. He held it in both of his and looked at it, which was a habit of his she had come to love, that way he had of looking at things he was grateful for as though gratitude required examination. "Boy or girl?" he said. "Do you have a feeling?" "I have no idea," she said. "Do you?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "I will be equally useless in either case and equally glad." She laughed. "You will not be useless." "I have no experience with infants," he said. "Neither have I," she said. "With my own, we will learn together." "We are good at that," he said. "We are," she agreed. The pregnancy proceeded well through the summer and fall. Dr. Hewitt monitored Frances with professional regularity and declared her constitution admirably sound. Jeremiah was attentive without being overbearing, which she appreciated enormously, because she had made it clear early in the pregnancy that she had not lost any of her capabilities, and had no intention of being treated as though she had, and he had taken this instruction with the straightforward respect he always gave her instructions. She rode Ciel until she was 6 months along, at which point she decided independently that the rides were becoming sufficiently uncomfortable to justify switching to the wagon, a transition she made without drama. She continued teaching the Caldwell children through October. She finished Jane Eyre and read it again, and then read it to Jeremiah a second time, and they had a long conversation one night about Rochester and his choices, and the nature of honesty in love that lasted past midnight and ended with Frances saying, "The whole book is about what it costs a woman to be treated as though her judgment is not to be trusted." "I think you are right," Jeremiah said. "I know I am right," she said, "but thank you for agreeing." He grinned. "You know, some husbands might resist being corrected at midnight." "Some husbands might," she said, "but you are not that kind of husband." "How do you know?" he asked. "Because," she said, "when I told you not to treat me as helpless because I was expecting, you listened immediately. Some men would have argued. You said yes and you meant it." "Of course I meant it," he said. "That," she said, "is what I mean." Their son was born in the last days of November 1881, in the bedroom of the ranch house, delivered by Dr. Hewitt with Edna Caldwell in attendance. It was a long night, and Jeremiah spent most of it on the front porch in the cold, because there was nothing useful for him to do inside, and he could not bear to be out of earshot, and Pete Sorensen sat with him in company and silence, which was the kind of friendship that required no other demonstration. When the baby cried for the first time and Edna came to the door and said it was a boy, a good healthy boy, Jeremiah sat down on the porch step and put his face in his hands, not from grief, but from the kind of relief that has weight, and Pete Sorensen said nothing, which was exactly right. He was allowed in shortly after, and he went to the bed where Frances lay, exhausted but entirely present, her hair loose around her and her face showing every hour of the night's effort, and something else beneath it, something like wonder, specific and private, the look of someone who has done something they were not entirely sure they could do and has done it. She was holding the boy, who was small and red and extremely adamant in his objections to the world. "He is angry," Jeremiah said softly, looking at the face. "He has opinions already," Frances said. "I find that encouraging." "What do we call him?" Jeremiah asked. They had talked about names. They had agreed it should be a name that worked in both languages, or at least that neither of them would have to substantially mispronounce. "Louis," Frances said. "It works in French and in English, and it was my father's name." "Louis Barlow," Jeremiah said. He tried it in French the way she had taught him, the French way, Louis without the S. "Louis," he said again. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly right." He sat on the edge of the bed, careful of the space she occupied, and looked at his son, and then at his wife, and found that the whole compass of his world had shifted in the night to accommodate two centers of gravity instead of one, and that he was entirely well with this. Louis Barlow was a determined child from the beginning, which surprised no one. He grew through 1882 with the efficiency of someone who has a schedule to keep and is serious about it. He walked at 11 months. He had opinions about everything by 14 months, which he expressed in a combination of English and French, because he heard both languages equally. His mother's French a constant warmth in the house, and his father's English the other half of the world. He said his first clear sentence in English at 18 months, "More, please," and his first in French at 20 months, "Encore, maman," which Frances wrote in her notebook with the particular satisfaction of someone whose experiment has been confirmed. "He will be bilingual," she told Jeremiah with considerable pleasure. "Did you ever doubt it?" he said. "No," she said, "but it is good to see it in practice." In 1882, an event occurred that shook Dust Creek more than any other in recent memory. A fire broke out in the main street in late summer, consuming the general store and two adjacent buildings. No one was killed, which was the most important fact, but Dale Hutchins lost his store and its entire contents, and the damage to the street was severe. The town organized a recovery effort with the practical collective energy that frontier communities brought to disaster, and Jeremiah was among the first to commit labor and material, arriving with Pete Sorensen and two other ranch hands the morning after the fire, and working through a week of clearing and reconstruction. Frances organized something alongside, which she did with characteristic efficiency, a series of donation collections from the surrounding farms, food for the workers, a careful account of what was needed and who had committed what. She set up a system using her notebooks and her precise, organized mind, and within a week she had created the kind of clear logistical structure that Dale Hutchins later said was the only reason the reconstruction had been manageable. Dale Hutchins, who had initially regarded the Frenchwoman with the polite uncertainty of a man encountering something outside his experience, revised his assessment entirely and told anyone who would listen that Frances Barlow was the most organized person in Dust Creek, regardless of origin. The store was rebuilt by October. During the recovery, Frances had also negotiated, without anyone quite realizing that was what she was doing, the expansion of the store's inventory to include books and writing materials, which Dust Creek had never had in sufficient supply, using her argument that a town with children had an obligation to educate them properly. And the argument was so calmly delivered and clearly reasoned that Dale Hutchins agreed before he fully understood he had made a decision. The school question had been on Frances's mind for some time. Dust Creek had no proper schoolhouse. Children learned at home if they were fortunate enough to have educated parents, or not at all. Frances had been teaching the Caldwell children, but she was increasingly aware of other children in the area who had no such arrangement. She began talking about this to Jeremiah in the evenings, and he listened with the particular quality of attention he gave to her when she was working through something important. "There should be a school," she said, "a real one, not just the children whose parents can arrange a governess." "I know," he said. "Would the town support it?" she asked. "Some of them," he said. "Others would need persuading." "I am good at persuading," she said. "I know you are," he said, with a warmth that contained 6 years of accumulated evidence. She brought the proposal to the town meeting in January of 1883. She stood before the assembled men, and it was mostly men, because that was the reality of who gathered to make public decisions in 1883 in Dust Creek, Texas, a fact she was acutely aware of, and she laid out her argument in English that was now entirely fluent, accented still with France but no longer constrained by it. She explained the need, the benefit, the practical requirements, the available options for funding. She anticipated the objections and addressed them before they were raised. She did not apologize for her presence or her authority. She stood the way she had always stood, with her chin up and her voice clear, and her intelligence offered without disguise. Jeremiah sat in the second row and watched her and thought, not for the first time, that he was the luckiest man in Texas. The school was approved. It required additional effort, additional argument, and several private conversations in subsequent months, and Frances drove all of it. A building was designated, a solid wooden structure at the edge of town that had been used as a storage space, and it was fitted out through community contributions. A teacher was needed, and Frances assumed the role through the first year while a proper candidate could be found, teaching 3 days a week while maintaining the Caldwell children's lessons on alternating days and managing Louis, who at 18 months was aggressively curious about everything and required either constant supervision or regular interesting challenges. Through all of it, Jeremiah continued to learn French. He was not systematic the way Frances was about English. He had no notebooks with lists, no formal approach. But he absorbed words the way he absorbed most things, steadily and without fanfare, accumulating them over the years until in 1883 he could hold a genuine conversation in French, slowly, with pauses for the right word, but genuinely. He could read a French sentence if it was not too elaborate. He could write simple things. Frances discovered the extent of his French one evening when she was writing a letter to her friend in Lyon, and he was sitting at the same table reading, and she asked him absently to pass the ink without looking up, and said it in French, "Passe-moi l'encre, s'il te plaît," and he passed it without pausing in his own reading, and then they both realized what had happened and looked at each other. "You understood me perfectly," she said. "Yes," he said. "You have been keeping your progress a secret," she said, not accusatory but with a specific kind of pleasure. "I wanted to surprise you," he said. "You have surprised me," she said. "Is that good?" he asked. She stood up from her chair, crossed the few feet between them, and kissed him with a thoroughness that made him put his book down, and then she said against his cheek in French, "You have been surprising me for years. I hope you never stop." "Je ne m'arrêterai pas," he said. "I will not stop." She leaned back and looked at him. "Your accent," she said, "is still terrible." "I know," he said. "Does that bother you?" "Absolutely not," she said. "It sounds like you." By the mid-1880s, the Barlow ranch had grown. Jeremiah had added to the herd through careful management, and one well-timed purchase of land from a neighbor who had decided on California. And the operation was solid, not wealthy by Eastern standards, but successful by any honest assessment of what the land offered. Pete Sorensen had become the ranch foreman and had married a woman named Sarah, who was from a German farming family east of town, and the two couples had a friendship that was easy and real, and marked by frequent Sunday dinners at one house or the other. Frances had found in Sarah Sorensen another genuine friend, and the four of them spent evenings on the Barlow porch through the Texas summers drinking coffee and talking about everything: the cattle market, the politics they read about in the Austin paper, the children, the future. Pete Sorensen had come to understand French passably well from exposure alone, which he claimed was proof that the language was not as difficult as people made it. And Frances said that was possibly true if one had unlimited hours of immersion, and Pete said he had unlimited hours if you counted the dinners. In the summer of 1884, Frances discovered she was expecting their second child. She told Jeremiah on the porch in the evening in the same way she had told him the first time, directly, watching his face. He had the same stillness, the same long breath, the same careful holding of her hand. "Louis will be pleased," Jeremiah said. "Louis will be complicated about it," Frances said accurately. "He will need time." Louis was indeed complicated about it for approximately 2 weeks, during which he was unusually difficult and unusually attached to Frances simultaneously. And then he arrived at some private accommodation with the situation, and became instead intensely curious about the logistics of where babies came from, which Frances explained to him with the scientific directness she applied to all his questions, and which made Jeremiah leave the room to conceal his expression. The second child was a girl, born in February of 1885, in the same bedroom, delivered again by Dr. Hewitt, who by now felt like a member of the family. They named her Marguerite Maggie in English, Margaret in French, depending on who was speaking, and she arrived in the world with considerably more patience than her brother had shown, looked around at the room with large dark eyes, and appeared to immediately begin evaluating everything she saw. "She looks like you," Jeremiah said, looking at the baby. "She has your eyes," Frances said. "She looks like she is already making a plan," he said. "Then she definitely looks like me," Frances said and smiled. Louis, who had been allowed to come in to meet his sister after the initial commotion had settled, stood beside the bed with the careful gravity of a child taking a serious responsibility seriously. He looked at Marguerite for a long time and then said, in the precise mixed English-French that was his natural idiom, "Elle est petite, she is small." "She will grow," Frances said. "You were small too." Louis considered this information. "Will she learn to ride?" he asked. "Eventually," Jeremiah said. "Will she speak French?" Louis asked. "Yes," Frances said. Louis nodded. "Good," he said with satisfaction. "Then we can talk without everyone understanding." Jeremiah looked at his son with great fondness and some concern. "I understand French," he said. Louis had not fully accounted for this. He looked at his father with recalibrated respect. "Oh," he said. Life with 2 children was louder and more complicated and more wonderful than life with 1. And Frances managed it all in the way she managed everything, with systems, with directness, with a quality of loving attention that was neither soft nor distant but fully present in the way of someone who had thought carefully about what it meant to give someone your real attention rather than the performance of it. She had not stopped teaching at the school. The proper teacher, a young woman named Helen Graves from Austin, had arrived in 1884 and had assumed the primary teaching duties. But Frances remained involved, organizing the curriculum, sourcing books, occasionally teaching French to the older children because she believed that knowing another language was not a luxury but a form of freedom, and she said so plainly when anyone questioned the inclusion. There was, by now, no one in Dust Creek who questioned Frances Barlow on subjects she considered important. This was not from intimidation. She had never used intimidation. It was not her method, but from the accumulated weight of her having been right, consistently and demonstrably, about enough things that the burden of proof had shifted. When Frances Barlow said something was a good idea, people listened. In the spring of 1886, a woman arrived in Dust Creek who reminded Frances, in some precise and bittersweet way, of herself. She stepped off the stagecoach, a younger stagecoach now, a different line, part of the expansion that the railroad had brought to the region. And she was alone and her English was poor, though in her case it was not French but Polish. And she stood on the main street of Dust Creek with a trunk and a bag and the specific expression of someone who has made an irreversible decision and is meeting the consequences of it. Her name was Zofia Nowak, and she was 22 years old, and she had a letter, as Frances had had a letter. And the letter was for a man who had written to her from Dust Creek promising employment that did not entirely materialize as described. She had come because there was nothing in Poland to return to. Frances saw her from across the street, coming out of the store with Louis beside her. She said to Louis, "Wait here," and crossed the street. She introduced herself in English, got no comprehension, tried French, got no comprehension, and then simply took Zophia's hands and said, "It is all right. I understand." She could see from the woman's face that the tone was understood even if the words were not. She brought Zophia home. Jeremiah, arriving from the barn to find a young Polish woman at his kitchen table drinking coffee and his wife writing rapidly in 2 different notebooks simultaneously, adjusted to the situation with the equanimity of a man, long accustomed to the fact that his wife's moral compass was considerably larger than the average household. They found Zophia a position with a good family in town, the Wentworths, who ran the hotel and had been looking for assistance. Frances visited her twice a week through the summer and acted as a bridge until Zophia's English developed enough to not require bridging, and when Zophia was settled and confident enough, she wrote Frances a letter in careful, newly learned English saying that she had met a man named Edward Wentworth, the hotel owner's son, as it happened, and that she thought she might stay in Dust Creek a very long time. Frances read the letter on the porch and passed it to Jeremiah and said nothing. He read it and said, "That is a good outcome." "It is," she said. "Are you thinking about yourself?" he asked. When you arrived, she was quiet for a moment. "I am thinking about how much depends on one person deciding to cross the street," she said. He looked at her profile in the afternoon light, this woman from Lyon, France, who had arrived speaking only French and had rebuilt her entire world from a single failed plan and had never once asked the world to accommodate her at the expense of its honesty. "I am very glad I crossed the street," he said. She turned to look at him. "GT aim," she said. "GT aim Aussie," he said. And his accent was still not good, and it still sounded exactly like him, and it was still the most important French he had ever spoken. The years after 1886 settled into a rhythm that was full rather than quiet, productive and warm, marked by the specific texture of a life well constructed. Louis grew into a serious, curious boy who could argue in 2 languages simultaneously, and who showed, by the time he was 8, a striking aptitude for mathematics that Frances cultivated with fierce attention. Marguerite Maggie was 4 years his junior and possessed of a personality that was some combination of her mother's directness and her father's steadiness, which made her both extremely easy to be around and entirely impossible to argue with, a combination the family identified early and respected always. The ranch prospered through the late 1880s. Jeremiah made decisions carefully and without excessive risk, and the cattle market, which was volatile in those years. The terrible winter of 1886 had devastated many operations across the territory, spared the Barlow Ranch through some combination of good management and good fortune, the two being, as Jeremiah believed, not entirely unrelated. He had diversified the operation slightly, adding a small horse breeding program that Pete Sorensen ran with great enthusiasm and considerable skill, and this became a reliable source of income independent of the cattle market swings. In 1888, Frances's friend from Lyon, the one who had been writing letters since 1879, came to Texas. Her name was Celeste Aubert, and she was Frances's oldest friend, and when Frances received her letter saying she intended to visit and asking if that would be welcome, Frances replied immediately in French, the long, fluid French she still wrote in, her full self in every sentence, saying not only was it welcome, but that Celeste should plan to stay for as long as she wished, because Texas in summer was a thing that had to be experienced by someone who had known her before she became Texan. Celeste Aubert arrived in July of 1888, small and dark and energetic, and she stepped off the train. There was a train now, the railroad having reached closer to Dust Creek in 1885, and looked around at Texas with an expression of profound interest. She and Frances embraced on the platform in the way of women who have been friends since girlhood and have not seen each other for 9 years, which is an embrace that is partly hello and partly 9 years of letters becoming real again. And they talked in French for the first 20 minutes without stopping, speaking over and around each other with the ease of people who share a language in a particular bone-deep way that goes beyond the words to the rhythms and the assumptions underneath. Jeremiah watched this from a polite distance and thought that he had never seen his wife quite so much herself before, or rather, he had never seen one specific dimension of herself that had existed before Texas, and that Texas, in all its richness, had never been able to fully accommodate. He thought that this was not a failure of Texas. It was simply the nature of a person with a history, some of who you are lives in the language you first learned to love in. Celeste stayed for 6 weeks. She was charmed by everything: the sky, the children, the horses, the cooking, the community. She was particularly taken with Pete Sorensen, who returned the regard with an enthusiasm that Sarah Sorensen monitored with amused patience and absolute security. Celeste made it clear she was not susceptible to a married man's attention, however unconsciously offered, and the 4 of them had a number of excellent dinners on the Barlow porch that summer. On the night before Celeste left, she and Frances sat on the porch alone after the children were in bed, and Jeremiah had diplomatically found something to do at the barn, and they talked for 2 hours in French about everything about Lyon, about their girlhood, about the people they had been, and the people they had become. "You are happy," Celeste said. It was not a question. "Yes," Frances said, genuinely. "It is not what I imagined for you," Celeste said. "When you left, I thought I could not imagine this." She gestured at the dark ranch around them, the mesquite trees, the enormous sky. "But I could not imagine this, Frances, either." She meant it as a compliment. "You are more yourself, not less. Does that make sense?" "It makes sense," Frances said. "I think I had to come to a place where no one knew who I was supposed to be so that I could decide who I actually was." Celeste considered this. "And the man," she said, "he is responsible for some of that, yes." "Some," Frances said. "And I am responsible for some of his. That is what it should be, I think." "He loves you the right way," Celeste said. "I can see it. He loves you in the way that makes more of you, not less." "Yes," Frances said, "that is exactly it." Celeste returned to Lyon in August of 1888, and Frances watched the train go with the specific feeling of farewell that does not mean forever but is still a real goodbye. And then she turned around and Jeremiah was standing at her shoulder, because he had come to the station to see Celeste off and had positioned himself where she could feel him when she turned. She leaned against him briefly and he put his arm around her. "All right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I will write to her tonight." "In French," he said. "In French," she confirmed. "Some things need French." She paused. "But this," she pressed her hand briefly against his, "this is in every language." By 1889, Louis was 8 years old and Marguerite was 4, and the Barlow household had the particular organized energy of a family in full motion. Louis had declared that he wanted to be an engineer, a fact he announced with such certainty that no one questioned it. He had been reading everything he could find about bridges and railroads, which the Austin paper and the books Frances ordered through the store provided in reasonable supply. Frances had written to the university in Austin about what preparation would be required, and had received a letter back with a curriculum outline that she had posted on the wall of Louis's room and which he studied with reverence. Marguerite, 4 years old and not to be outdone, had announced that she intended to be a doctor, an ambition she had formed based on her admiration for Dr. Hewitt, who had become something of a family fixture over the years and who, when Frances told him of this ambition, sat down with Marguerite very seriously at the kitchen table and explained that it would require a great deal of study and a very tough constitution. And Marguerite listened carefully and said, in her precise bilingual way, "D'accord, okay," and that was that. Dr. Hewitt, who had long since reached the age where he should have retired but had not done so because Dust Creek needed a doctor more than he needed to retire, said to Jeremiah afterward that the Barlow children were going to do something with the world, and he meant it as the highest compliment and the most serious prediction. The spring of 1890 brought a drought that tested the ranch more severely than anything since Jeremiah had inherited it. The grass burned back early, and the cattle needed to be moved to better pasture on the eastern portion of the land, which required work and planning, and the kind of sustained attention that left little room for anything else. It was a hard several months, and Jeremiah pushed through them with the methodical endurance he was known for, but Frances saw the weight of it on his face in the evenings, the particular quality of tired that is more than physical. She did not offer empty comfort. She did not say things would be fine when she did not know that they would be. What she did was sit with him in the evenings and talk practically about the options and the numbers and what they knew. And when talking was not what was needed, she sat beside him in the quiet that had never been empty between them and let him have the weight without requiring him to pretend it was lighter. The drought broke in August with a storm that came over the plains with the theatrical buildup that only Texas summer storms managed, and it rained for 3 days, not enough to make up for the deficit of the spring and early summer, but enough to change the tenor of the season. The cattle came through better than Jeremiah had feared. The horse program had remained profitable through it. The ranch survived the year. On the evening of the first day of real rain, Frances and Jeremiah sat on the covered porch listening to it on the roof and watching the lightning far to the south move across the horizon. "I used to be afraid of thunder," Frances said, "when I was small." "What happened?" he asked. "My father told me," she said, "that thunder is just the sky expressing an opinion very loudly and that there is nothing wrong with having opinions, even loud ones." She paused. "I was not afraid of it after that." Jeremiah smiled. "Your father sounds like he knew what he was doing." "He did," she said. "For the time he had." She was quiet for a moment. "I wish he could have known you." "What do you think he would have said?" Jeremiah asked. She considered this carefully. "He would have said, 'A man who listens is worth more than a man who talks,' and then he would have been very pleased with himself for saying it." "I am going to remember that," Jeremiah said. "He would have been glad," she said. The 1890s brought changes to Dust Creek and to Texas that were both welcome and uncomfortable. The railroad expanded further, bringing more people and more commerce, and also more of the complications that came with a frontier becoming less of a frontier. Dust Creek grew. New families arrived. The school that Frances had fought for became a proper institution, and Helen Graves, the teacher, became a fixture of the community, who eventually married the postmaster and raised 4 children of her own, all of whom she taught personally on the side. Frances was 40 years old in 1895, and the years on her were not wear but texture, the kind that comes from a life lived with full attention. She was still teaching, occasionally, at the school when Helen needed her, and she had by now written 2 small books, not novels, but collections of observations about Texas, about the experience of making a home in a language not your own, about what it meant to translate yourself while remaining fundamentally yourself. She had sent these, tentatively, to a publisher in New York, on the advice of a visiting journalist who had come through Dust Creek in 1893 and had read some of her notebooks, and said with evident sincerity that they were the most interesting things he had read about Texas because they were written from outside and inside simultaneously. The publisher wrote back in 1895 with interest and with questions, and Frances sat down at the kitchen table with Jeremiah's hand on her shoulder and read the letter 3 times. "They want to publish it," she said. "Yes," he said. "Both of them," she said, "together, as 1 volume. "Yes," he said again. She looked at him. "You do not seem surprised." "I am not surprised," he said. "I have been reading your work for 15 years. I am surprised it took this long." She looked back at the letter. Her eyes were bright. "It will not make us wealthy," she said. "The terms are not extravagant." "That is not the point," he said. "No," she agreed. "It is not the point." The book was published in the spring of 1896, and it found its readers, people in the East who were curious about the West and about the experience of arriving somewhere new and making it yours, and people in Europe who had relatives who had done the same and wanted to understand what it felt like. Frances received letters from readers in New York, in Boston, in Lyon, in Paris, in London. She answered every letter. She kept every letter. Jeremiah read the published book as though he had not read it in drafts for 3 years, which in a way he hadn't, because the final version was different, more assembled, more complete, more fully itself. He read it in 3 evenings, and when he finished he sat for a long time at the kitchen table. "What?" Frances asked, watching him. "There is a passage," he said, "near the end, about the day I carried your trunk up the hotel stairs." "Yes," she said. "You wrote that you thought I was a man who would not know what to do with a woman who was entirely herself," he said, "that you had decided you would prove otherwise if given the chance." "I did think that," she said. "And did I?" he asked. "Know what to do?" She smiled, that smile, the one that had rearranged her face on the boardwalk in 1879 and had been doing it ever since. "You did better than that," she said. "You were glad of it." "I was," he said. "I am." In 1897, Louis Barlow, 16 years old, applied for admission to the University of Texas at Austin, which had opened in 1883, and had been the destination Frances had been preparing him for since he was 8 years old. He was accepted, and the day the letter arrived, Frances made a dinner that was French in character. She cooked the way her mother had, when there was something to celebrate, and the family sat at the table and toasted Louis's future in both languages. And Louis, who was tall and brown-haired and had his mother's eyes and his father's quality of stillness, said his thank yous in French out of a private sentimentality he would have denied if accused of it. Jeremiah took Louis to Austin in the fall of 1897, a 3-day journey by train, and when he came back he was quieter than usual for a week, which Frances let him be, because she understood that it was a particular kind of quiet. "He is ready," she said one evening. "I know," he said. "That is the thing." "You did that," she said. "We did that." "He did that," Jeremiah said. "We only kept the road clear." "That," she said, "is everything." Marguerite, 12 years old and deeply invested in her plan to become a doctor, took Louis's departure as both a loss and an opportunity. A loss of her brother's company and an opportunity to have their parents' full attention, which she managed with a subtlety that was either unconscious or very skilled, and Jeremiah believed it was the latter. She was a remarkable girl, precise and warm, and with a quality of persistence that had been honed over 12 years of having Frances Pritchard Barlow as a mother. Dr. Hewitt, who was by 1897 in his 70s, and finally, reluctantly, slowing down, had been taking Marguerite seriously as an interested student for 2 years, allowing her to accompany him on uncomplicated calls and explaining his thinking. He told Frances privately that the child had the instinct for it. That instinct was not teachable, and Marguerite had it, and that if the world continued to move in the direction it had been moving, there would be women doctors in her lifetime, and he intended to tell her so. He did tell her, and Marguerite received the information with the calm confidence of someone who had always planned accordingly. The last years of the 19th century moved with the combination of speed and weight that all final passages carry. The world was changing around Dust Creek. The frontier that had defined Texas was becoming history even as people were still living in it. The open range of the cattle drives giving way to fenced land and rail shipment, the Wild West of legend being simultaneously lived and already past. Jeremiah felt this sometimes on the ranch, the sense of an era completing itself, and he talked about it with Frances in the evenings in the way they talked about everything, with honesty and without sentimentality. "Does it make you sad?" she asked him once. "The changing." "Some of it," he said. "But change is not the same as loss, and some of what people call the old way was not worth keeping." She nodded. She knew what he meant. She had watched over 20 years the injustices of the frontier world, the ways in which land was taken and people were dispossessed, the ways in which the law served some and not others, the ways in which a person's worth was calculated on criteria that had nothing to do with their actual worth. She had watched it as an outsider who had also been inside, and the dual perspective had given her both clarity and pain. "There is still so much to make right," she said. "Yes," he said. "But there is also so much that is right, more than there was." She considered this. "My book," she said. "A woman in New York wrote to me that it made her think differently about what it means to belong somewhere, that she had never thought about the fact that belonging is something you build, not something you are given." "That is true," he said. "I thought that was the most important thing I had written," she said. "That you make your home, it is not made for you." He reached across the table and took her hand. "You made a home," he said, "in a language that was not yours and a place that was not yours, and you made it yours completely." "We made it," she said. The turn of the century came with celebrations across Texas that even Dust Creek participated in, a dance in the church field as it had always been, but larger now, the town having grown, the community having deepened its roots into the dry Texas ground. Frances and Jeremiah danced at the New Year's celebration as they had danced at the harvest dance all those years ago, and they danced well, the way people dance who have been dancing together long enough to not need to think about it. Louis came home for the holiday from Austin, where he was in his 3rd year and doing brilliantly, according to his professors, and Marguerite was 16, and had announced that she intended to attend the medical school in Galveston when the time came, a plan that Frances had already begun researching, because that was how Frances approached plans. On the first morning of the new century, Frances sat on the porch in the cool January air with her coffee and her notebook, and she wrote in French, as she still did every morning, writing herself into the day. She wrote about the ranch and the sky, about the children, about the way Jeremiah had looked at midnight when the year turned. That same look he had always had, the one that said he was exactly where he intended to be. She wrote, "I arrived in this country speaking only French, and I thought it was the most alone I had ever been. I was wrong. I was on the edge of everything. The whole life was ahead of me, and I did not know it, and the cowboy across the street did not know it, and we built it together word by word, the way you build anything real, with patience, with honesty, with the willingness to keep trying even when the language is unfamiliar." She heard the screen door, and Jeremiah came out with his own coffee and settled into the chair beside her without needing to know what she was writing, because her needing to write in the mornings was as known to him as the color of her eyes. They sat in the new century's first morning and watched the sun come over the flat Texas land, that enormous unconstrained sun that had no buildings to catch it on the way up, and the light spread across the ranch in the slow, certain way of something that had been doing this for a long time and intended to keep doing it. "What are you writing?" he asked after a while. "About us," she said. "About the beginning." "The beginning," he said. "You stepped off the stagecoach. You crossed the street," she said. "You held out your hand," he said. "Je m'appelle Frances Pritchard," she said, and said it the French way, with all its syllables and its particular weight, the way she had said it to him in 1879 on the main street of Dust Creek, the first words between them, the introduction that had been also, though neither of them knew it then, the beginning of everything. He said her name back to her, Frances, exactly right, exactly as he had learned it from her, exactly as he had said it 10,000 times since, and it still landed the same way it always had, like something meant to be held carefully. "Say something else," she said. "In French," he thought. He had been thinking in French for 20 years now, occasionally in certain moods, and the words came to him with the unhurried certainty of things well learned. "Tu es chez toi ici," he said. "You are at home here." She looked at the ranch around them, at the sky that was now pale gold at the horizon and deep blue overhead, at the mesquite trees and the cottonwood by the creek and the horses in the near pasture, and the barn Pete Sorensen had helped rebuild after the fire years ago, and the house that had grown, over 20 years, from Spartan to inhabited to genuinely, deeply home. Je suis chez moi partout avec toi, she said. I am at home everywhere with you. He reached over and took her hand on the armrest of the chair, and she laced her fingers through his, and they sat in the first morning of the 20th century with the weight of everything behind them and the particular lightness of people who have nothing left to be afraid of, nothing left to prove, and everything still to enjoy. Louis would graduate in 2 years and would indeed become an engineer and would build bridges, real ones, and would marry a woman from San Antonio named Clara, a different Clara than the Caldwell girl, though he had grown up knowing the Caldwell Clara and would always speak warmly of her, and would bring his family back to Dust Creek at Christmas every year for the rest of his parents' lives. Marguerite would attend the medical school in Galveston in 1902 and would become, in fact, a doctor, one of a small number of women who managed it in those years through extraordinary persistence and extraordinary ability, and she would return to the area eventually and practice medicine in Dust Creek and in the surrounding communities, and people would come from considerable distances to be treated by a doctor who had her mother's quality of paying complete, respectful attention to the person in front of her. Dr. Hewitt retired in 1901 and gave Marguerite his medical bag when he did, with a ceremony that was brief and deliberate and meant everything it meant. The Barlow Ranch would remain in the family for another generation after Jeremiah and Frances, tended by Louis's eldest son, who had his great-grandmother's French and his grandfather Jeremiah's hands. But on that January morning in 1900, none of that was known yet. What was known was the coffee and the morning light and the hand in hand, and the 21 years of Saturdays and lessons and lassos and books read aloud, and a little boy who said encore, Mammon, and a little girl who planned to be a doctor, and a language that had been the first bridge between them, and had become the second language of a household and the first language of a marriage. Frances Pritchard had arrived in Dust Creek speaking only French, and the cowboy across the street had said, "Teach me," and she had done it, starting with her name, Frances, 2 syllables, a name that came from so far away and had traveled so far and had arrived exactly where it was supposed to be. And Jeremiah Barlow, who had never expected any of this when he crossed a street on a summer afternoon in 1879, because a woman was standing alone, and the right thing to do was to go across, had learned French, and in doing so had learned that the world was larger than Texas, and larger than English, and larger than anything he had assumed it to be, and that this was not an unsettling fact but the best possible one. They sat together in the morning, and the light kept coming, and the ranch was alive around them with the sounds they both knew now, the sounds of their life, and there was nothing left unfinished, nothing left unsaid, nothing left that needed resolving, only the good, ordinary, extraordinary particular morning going on and on into the rest of their long and well-inhabited lives.